Good evening and welcome. My name is Andy. I'm the events director of the Oxford Climate Society and a current master's student at Oxford studying environmental change and management. The Oxford Climate Society is a student organization at Oxford University aiming to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders. In addition to our speaker events, we run educational programs throughout the year, including our School of Climate Change and the world's largest student climate journal, The Anthroposphere. And we're currently working with the university to develop net zero policies and to incorporate climate into the Oxford curriculums. The theme of today's event is climate communications, and it's a particularly relevant topic for our times of unprecedented polarization and division. Just to illustrate, a recent 2018 Pew Research Center survey found declining mutual trust amongst 64% of US adults, with only around a third of British adults claiming that they trust the news media. So it's really imperative that we cultivate the vocabulary and the visual tools with which to properly convey climate-related information. Because after all, it is words and languages and shared stories that are the building blocks of human societies. They're what enable us to collaborate, to engage in collective learning, and ultimately to imagine a better future together. To provide insight into this topic, we are delighted to be joined by Anthony Leiserowitz and Finn Harries. Finn Harries is a British filmmaker and designer. He is the co-founder of Earthrise Studio, a digital media company dedicated to communicating the climate crisis through research, design, and filmmaking. Finn began filmmaking in 2011 when he launched the YouTube channel Jack's Gap with his brother Jack Harries, which grew quickly to 4 million subscribers with over 150 million views. In 2015, Finn took a hiatus from YouTube to begin his studies in architecture at the Parsons School of Design in New York. He went on to study at the Architectural Association in London, graduating in 2019. He is currently studying at the University of Cambridge to complete a Master's of Philosophy in Architecture and Urban Design. His research focuses on regenerative design and ecology. Anthony Leiserowitz is the founder and director of the Yale program on climate change communication. He is an expert on public climate change and environmental beliefs, attitudes, policy preferences, and behavior, and the psychological, cultural, and political factors that shape them. He conducts research at the global, national, and local scales, including many surveys of the American public. He has published more than 200 scientific articles, chapters, and reports, and has served as a contributing author, panel member, advisor, or consultant to organizations including the IPCC, the Harvard Kennedy School, the United Nations Development Program, the National Academy of Sciences, among others. He is a recipient of the Friend of the Planet Award from the National Center for Science Education and the Stephen H. Snyder Award for Outstanding Climate Science. We're going to start this event with a speech from each of Finn and Anthony, which will then be followed by some questions from myself before opening it up to questions from the audience at the end. If you have any questions for either or both of our speakers, please write them in the live stream chat on the right-hand side of the YouTube stream. So thank you so much, Finn and Anthony, for joining us this evening. I'll pass it over to you, Anthony, to start us off.
Wonderful. Let's see here. Let me get my screen up. And Andy, can I get a thumbs up from you that you can see this okay?
All good on my side.
Okay, wonderful. Well, good evening, everyone. Great to be with you. Thanks so much for the invitation to join you. I wish I was only joining you in person, but hopefully in the not too distant future. So again, my name is Anthony Leiserowitz. I'm a faculty member at the Yale School of the Environment, where I direct the Yale program on climate change communication. And as Andy described, we do a lot of research and have now for about 20 years looking at how publics respond to this issue and basically trying to understand, why do some people get really engaged with this topic? Others are kind of apathetic, and some are downright dismissive and hostile, at least in the United States, and to a certain extent in the UK, but not in the rest of the world, though I'll talk about that in a minute. We also take what we've learned from all of this body of research and these insights and have our own direct-to-public effort that we call Climate Connections. And all of this is available as a website, but it's basically a climate news service that we started over a decade ago with environmental journalists across the country, as well as about 7 years ago, a national radio program with a brand new story every single day that plays on 680 frequencies around the country. And that really is rooted in the research. So if you want to ultimately see how we try to apply these learnings in practice, I'd encourage you to come visit the website climateconnections.org. Okay, so let me start here. I'm going to just touch on a few key things along the way. There's plenty here left, though, for us to talk about in the Q&A. And I'm going to start with a basic proposition. And that is that it would be wonderful. It would be great if everyone in the world, all 7.5 billion of us, could have the equivalent of a climate change 101 class, a full semester, preferably taught at Yale or maybe at Oxford too, dedicated to really understanding here's how the climate system works. Here's what the causes are. Here's what the consequences are going to be. Here's what the solutions are. Okay, that would be great. But unfortunately, that's never going to happen. Just simply never going to happen. The great majority of people don't have the interest, they don't have the background, they don't have the time to really dig in and understand the details. Now, very quickly, I'm not saying that there aren't, in fact, millions of people around the world who do want those details. There are. And in fact, we in the expert community need to go more than halfway to meet them where they are and answer their questions as best we can. But that's not going to be most people. Again, not on a planet of 7.5 heading towards 9 plus billion people. Most people are only going to have limited shelf space dedicated to this issue or frankly, most other important issues in their head. So the real question is, what is the most important things for people to know? Is it vital that everyone on Earth understand how the carbon cycle works? Probably not. Is it vital that everyone understands exactly how many parts per million of CO2 there is in the atmosphere at any given time? Again, probably not. And in the course of our work and some of our colleagues around the country and around the world, we think we've identified at least 5 critical key facts that everyone as a baseline should understand. Now, if you're a water resource manager or something like that, obviously you need much more specialized knowledge. But for most people, we think these 5 key facts are really important. And moreover, we boiled those 5 key facts down to just 10 words, but a friend of mine in Congress writes haikus on the side, so I'm going to give you the 11-word version. So here we go. Scientists agree. It's real, it's us, it's bad, but there's hope. Okay. Now, these are simple, okay, but they are deceptively simple. I like to call these meta ideas because each one of these ideas you can basically is a conclusion that you're trying to draw in your audience's mind through multiple stories, examples, charts, data, emotional experiences, et cetera, that help people come to understand these 5 key ideas, okay? That scientists agree. In fact, we just had 2 new papers come out last week that now say the scientific consensus is that about 99.9% of all published scientists are in agreement that climate change is happening in human cause. It's real. Here's all the ways that we know that climate change is happening right now. Moreover, and that it's us, that this is the direct result of human industrial activities. Of course, the climate has changed naturally over millions and even billions of years in the past. This time it's different. It's the direct result of human activities. Here are the thousands of ways that climate change is bad right now and going to get much worse in the future if we continue on the current path. And then last but not least is that there's hope. And this is one of the things where, frankly, as a community, we have generally failed to really communicate effectively of what do we do? What are the solutions? And that's still a huge, giant need in this larger space, but I'll touch on that issue in a bit. Okay, so that's a very simple but really important set of key facts that we suggest that everyone in the world ought to understand. So let me just touch on a few data points on how we're doing, at least on a few of these. So let me start here at the global scale. So 10 years ago, we partnered with the Gallup World Poll to do a study in about 130 countries around the world. And so this data is old. It's about 10 years old. And I can tell you, having just collected additional data in 31 countries and territories just a few months ago, that things have gotten better, but they haven't gotten that much better. And the basic patterns I'm about to describe are still very much the same. And that is when we ask people this first question, how much do you know about global warming or climate change? We found that 4 out of 10 adults on Earth had never heard of it before. That's nearly 2 billion people. And that increases to 2/3 or even 3/4 of the population in particularly vulnerable countries like India, like Egypt, like Bangladesh. Bangladesh, an international poster child of climate change vulnerability, and yet 2/3 of Bangladeshis had never heard of it before. Okay. Now, I will quickly say that just because people haven't heard of it doesn't mean they're not keenly aware of changes in their local climates. we actually find in most cases they are. So let's just take India as an example where we've done even deeper scale work. There too, we found 2/3 of Indians had never heard of climate change, but all we had to do was provide them a one-sentence description of what climate change is and how it affects local weather patterns. And immediately we had over 70% of respondents say, yes, that's happening. Yes, I'm really worried about it. Yes, I support my government taking action. Okay. But they lack the concept of climate change to make sense of these changes that they're experiencing in temperature, in precipitation, in growing seasons, in new pests, in the inability to grow particular crops. Again, all things that they're keenly aware of, but they lack the concept of climate change to make sense of those. And even more importantly, they lack the concept of climate change to inform their future decisions. And these are societies that are making huge bets about the future. Where are we going to build all of these new megacities that are going to come into being in just the next couple of decades? Okay, where are we going to build our roads and our bridges and site our hospitals and our schools? And to what tolerances should we be building? What crops are we going to grow in our country? If you're making those kinds of decisions without the benefit of the concept of climate change, you're almost certainly making really bad bets, because what we know is that humans tend to rely on our past experience, in other words, the climate of the past, to assume that that's the conditions that we're going to be living in the future. But if there's one thing we know about climate change, is that the future will not look like the past. It absolutely won't. So if people don't have this concept in mind, they can't be making smarter decisions that are, of course, going to have huge consequences for the viability of their lives, their economies, their societies going forward. So what you're seeing here is that when we asked this question, was a huge developed versus developing world divide, where the countries in blue are basically where awareness is very high, okay? But in red and orange is where awareness is really low. So again, a very stark divide between the developed and developing world. But then when we turn to the question of perceived risk, like, is climate change a problem? Let's get this working. Nope. There we go. Then we found just the inverse problem. Okay, so now this is of the people who are aware of climate change, how big of a threat is it to you and your family? And what you see here is that it's the countries in now red and orange that say that, where a very large proportion say, yes, this is a serious threat to me and to my family. Whereas, and it's mostly in the developing world, where it's in the developed world, in the richer countries, that say, nah, not so much. Okay, so, and of course, the countries in the developing world are quite right to say that they're at risk, because they live in societies that generally have far less resilience and adaptability to these problems than do the rich countries. All that said, it's also been very clear in recent years that the rich countries are hardly immune to climate impacts. In fact, here in the United States alone, it has been a brutal couple of years, especially this past year, with fires and floods and hurricanes and droughts and heat waves that have just been causing billion-dollar damage after billion-dollar disaster, one after another. So anyway, the key thing here then is that at the global scale, there's still a need to raise basic awareness in the developing world, but there's still a critical need to raise perceptions of the risk, of why this threat matters in the developed world. Okay, now to just quickly shift then, let me turn to the United States, where we've learned that not only are there differences, of course, between countries, but there are differences within countries. And here I'm going to draw on the United States as a starting point, but then I'll show you some global scale results in a moment. And that is that when we started this work 10 years ago, we very quickly realized that Americans don't have a single viewpoint on climate change. And so then people often divide the country into believers and deniers, but that's far too simplistic and really is not a very helpful framework. And one of the first rules of effective communication is know your audience. Who are they? What do they know? What do they think they know? How do they perceive this issue? Who do they trust? Where do they get their information? What are their underlying values? It's only once you understand who that audience is that you can then tailor your approach to meet them where they are. Not where you are, where they are, okay? To engage them on their terms to help them take the next step in their journey. And so we identified 10 years ago this these 6 different groups within the United States that each respond to this issue in very different ways. So here's a quick introduction. And this is as of last December, where we found that 26% of Americans are what we call alarmed. These are people who are firmly convinced climate change is real, it's human caused, it's a very serious problem, and they strongly support action. But the key question in their mind is, what do we do? They're already deeply concerned about climate change, but they don't know what they can do as individuals, what we can do as communities, or as states, as a nation, or the world. Because again, in general, we have not done a good job communicating what the solutions are. Then comes a group we call the concerned, 29% of the country, who say, yes, climate change is real, it's human caused, it's serious, but they still tend to think of it as a distant threat, that the impacts are distant in time, that we won't feel the impacts for a generation or more, or distant in space. This is about polar bears or maybe developing countries, but not the United States, not my state, not my community, not my friends, not my family, not me. And as a result, it becomes psychologically distant. It becomes just one of 100 other issues that's out there. And maybe I kind of support action, but I don't see why this is urgent. I don't see why this is something we have to deal with immediately. Then comes a group we call the cautious at 19%. These are people still on the fence. Is it real? Is it not? Is it human? Is it natural? Is it serious, or is it kind of overblown? They're paying attention, but are still kind of confused. Then a group we call the disengaged, 6%. These are people who basically say, you know, I think I might have heard that term global warming once, but I don't know anything about it. I don't know what the causes are, the consequences are, what the solutions are. They just really they lack even basic awareness. Then comes a group we call the doubtful. And these are people who say, I don't think it's real, but if it is, it's natural, just natural cycles. It gets hot, it gets cold, it'll get cooler again. So they don't really pay it too much attention or see it as much of a risk. And then come a group that we call the dismissive at 8%, who are firmly convinced this is not happening, it's not human caused, it's not a serious problem, and most of whom quite literally tell us that they're conspiracy theorists. They say it's a hoax, it's scientists making up data, it's a UN plot to take away American sovereignty, it's a get-rich scheme by Al Gore and his friends, and many other such conspiracy-type narratives. Now, importantly, they're 8%. They're only 8%. But they're a really loud 8%. They're a really vocal 8%, and they've tended to dominate the public square to such an extent that they've intimidated many in the rest of the country into what we call climate silence, that people don't talk about it because they're afraid that they're going to be talking to a dismissive and they're going to get into a big fight and an argument about it. In fact, 92% of the country is willing to have a constructive conversation, but the dismissive have basically been dominating the conversation for far too long in the United States. Okay, so that gives you a quick sense as to who these different kinds of audiences are. Now we've taken that same approach and used it now in 31 countries and territories. Now let me quickly say, it's always far better to develop a tailored segmentation for each individual country because, of course, different countries are different. And we've in fact done that in India, for example. We found 6 Indias, but they don't look like the 6 Americas. But this tool does allow us to use the same kinds of questions that are applicable in all countries across international lines so we can at least do cross-comparative comparisons. And that's what you're looking at here, is that we see huge differences around the world in terms of the proportions of the population that would fall into each of these different groups. So most notably, the alarmed, that group that is the most engaged with this issue, but eager to know what else can I do, is as high as 64% of the population in countries like Costa Rica, Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil. Notice those are all Latin American countries. And substantially lower in countries like the United States, or here's the United Kingdom at 31%. But it's also important to note that that dismissive group here in the purple is really, really tiny. I mean, it's basically non-existent in almost all countries until you get to the United States at about 11%, Australia at 8%. United Kingdom has actually gone down quite a bit in recent years, so it's down to 3%. So anyway, just to give you a quick sense that there are different audiences that each need to be engaged on their own terms in countries around the world. So just to quickly sum up, I have to emphasize how important it is. Know your audience, tailor your communications. The 6 audiences is one really useful framework. It's not the only one to use in that way of figuring out who is your audience. There are no formulas here, but this is a really useful heuristic or guideline. Simple, clear messages. Repeat it often, 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 repeat it often. We usually forget that part because you've got to say it over and over again. In fact, your audience is probably only hearing you at about the time that you are truly sick of hearing the same words come out of your mouth again. Okay, got to do that by a variety of trusted messengers, including you. And then just to come back to where we started, this basic 5 key facts. Scientists agree it's real, it's us, it's bad, but there's hope. And with that, thank you much.
Awesome. Thank you, Anthony. I think that sets a really great context, particularly in the global perspective of how climate communications is today. And so with that, we'll throw it over to Finn for his presentation.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Anthony. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Particularly love that last point. Okay, let me see if we can share the screen. Anthony, is that what, or Andy, sorry, is that working properly? Great. So this presentation is really a sort of combination of the research that I'm doing currently at Cambridge University as part of a master's degree in architecture and environmental design, and some of the work that I'm doing with my team at Earthrise Studio in communicating the climate crisis. And I'm going to do some sort of big picture thinking in a fairly short period of time. So bear with me, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end. The key point that I'm going to make is that to tackle the climate crisis, we need a fundamentally new perspective. This picture was taken on the eve of Christmas in 1969 by Bill Anders as he pointed his camera out of the window of the Apollo 8 spacecraft. It represents a very literal shift in perspective. When it was published, it changed the scale on which we generally think about ourselves and our community. The photo of Earthrise reminds us that we are all inhabiting a relatively small but beautiful rock. And at this scale, borders, nations, and social structures become abstract, and all that's left is a swirl of water vapor suspended in an atmosphere that supports the conditions for life. This picture, along with the environmental movement that was born at the end of the 1960s, started to challenge the way we think about ourselves in relation to the environment. It cemented something that we had forgotten, that we are not separate from nature, but rather we are a fundamental part of natural systems. In fact, we rely entirely on the health of the ecosystems around us, and in turn, our actions are not neutral. They either threaten or support the function of those ecosystems from which we benefit. The problem we face today isn't in ecology or ecosystems, despite the fact that we spend much of our time focused on climate graphs and extinction rates, but rather the problem that needs to be addressed is the human systems within which we operate. And our human systems are formed largely through our unique capacity for language, which gives us the ability to create stories by which to organize our lives. Yuval Noah Harari sums it up well in his book Sapiens when he says, any large-scale human cooperation, whether a modern state, a medieval church, an ancient city, or an archaic tribe, is rooted in common myths that exist only in people's collective imagination. This is useful when it comes to reflecting on our own individual agency in tackling the climate crisis. We can't address our capacity to create change without taking a step back to look at the cultural and social stories that shape our way of life. In other words, to take action on the climate crisis, we need to recognize that we exist within a civilization that is built on ideas and stories that are perhaps no longer compatible. At the root of our dominant global culture is a narrative of control and dominion that stems from religious doctrine and scientific empiricism. And I would argue that it is from these foundations that the climate crisis began. Therefore, it is these foundations that must be addressed in order to take action. This outer ring, for me, represents why it's so hard to reduce your impact on the climate, even when you're fully aware of the crisis. We're culturally trapped in an antiquated system. I spent many years reluctant to engage with the climate crisis because it seemed too big, too complex, and ultimately too depressing. Everything I read suggested to me that the future looked bleak. I couldn't find the optimism for what awaited on the other side. However, this diagram of the adaptive cycle changed my perspective when I came across it. To understand it, you need to be thinking on a civilizational level. It's by the Canadian ecologist C.S. Holling, who proposed that all social and ecological systems move roughly through this four-stage process. Take a forest fire, for example. During a fire, conditions are changed so significantly that the system ultimately collapses. Over time, it begins to process the nutrients from the remnants of the old forest, salvaging what it can. Naturally, it starts to reorganize itself to the new conditions that are left. New life develops, recycling, reorganizing, and regenerating, and the forest goes into a phase of growth using the resources available around it. As it repopulates the forest canopy, the growth slows down, conserves, and ultimately, in time, the process will repeat again. This is the function of all systems. They collapse and then they reorganize. This includes civilizations. We're not the first, and we won't be the last. I would argue that we are right now somewhere between stage 4 and 1. We're looking collapse or release in the face, but on the other side is an opportunity for reorganization. So what would that look like? American architect Bill Reed proposes a trajectory that goes from conventional practice as we know it today, which is fundamentally degenerative and based on industrial or technical processes, through sustainability, and up to regenerative, where we're operating in a symbiosis with living systems and our actions are positively reinforcing the conditions for life rather than threatening them. So at the broadest possible scale of time and space, it might be useful to think about our trajectory as humans as one that involves collapses and reorganizations through which we shift from destructive behavior through sustainability and up to regenerative stewardship. It's in this big picture vision that we shape the way we communicate the climate crisis at Earthrise. This kind of thinking is grounded in a pragmatic reality of how serious the situation is and how natural cycles actually function. But at the same time, it fosters the inspiration and the optimism for how things could be. So what we're doing at Earthrise is we're creating a space and a community where we can start to think about and communicate what a just transition would look like. It's a sort of forum for ideas that often question the very basis of the culture we live in and imagine how it might be different. We launched about 15 months ago during the global pandemic, at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, and of course, during the ongoing climate crisis. So it was clear to us from the get-go that the health of humans and the health of the planet is deeply connected, and that we're failing to give a voice to frontline communities that have been historically marginalized and oppressed. Our commitment is to share new perspectives and stories that give a broader understanding of the intersecting problems we face and how we might go about tackling them. We use design, photography, and video to engage a digital audience. And as our community grows, we continually introduce new faces, voices, and ideas into the ongoing debate. We create content across a number of themes that are motivated by some of the big questions that come up for young people when they engage with this topic. For example, this type of post works to highlight why we need such urgent change in communicating the scientific research of Johan Rockström and his team at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in tipping points and planetary boundaries. But communicating the problem doesn't go far enough. So we create content that helps direct people to where change is really needed and where to focus their energy as activists. One of the issues with climate communication in the past has been that it too often points the finger at the individual. This is largely a result of campaigns led by fossil fuel industry. BP, for example, invented the carbon footprint as part of a marketing campaign to shift responsibility back to the consumer. So we're flipping it on its head and turning the attention back to them, since ultimately they are the ones holding the levers of power. And finally, we try and create content around what change would actually look like, to create reference points for a just transition and to emphasize that we need to prioritize frontline communities who have almost always contributed the least to creating the problem. This year, we started shifting our model from simply an editorial platform on Instagram to a multi-platform production company that has the capacity to produce and distribute longer form content. The Breakdown was our first commissioned series that went across WaterBear Network, YouTube, and Instagram. We created a 5-part explainer series that draws together the perspectives from our platform to explain with animations and interviews from leading experts how we got here, where we're headed, and what we can do to take action. And we've just finished production on our second show, Seat at the Table, for YouTube Originals, which is an 11-part video series that premiered today on YouTube to share the voices of those on the front line of the climate crisis. And finally, we're keen to make sure that what we're communicating actually has an impact in the real world. And we often talk on Earthrise about the value of Indigenous wisdom and why we need to support Indigenous communities. And so we've launched Choose Earth in partnership with Choose Love as a fundraising campaign to provide much needed funds to Brazilian activists in their fight for social and environmental justice. Choose Earth is an example of a direct action you can take to support those who are actively fighting to protect some of the most biodiverse spaces on Earth. So I'm going to finish with a quote that inspires us at Earthrise a lot by the Indian writer Arundhati Roy. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. When we say another world is possible at Earthrise, we're trying to capture both the deep systemic nature of the change that is required. Another world means everything literally needs to change, but we're also trying to emphasize the hope and the optimism that not only can we do this, but we are at the best moment in history to usher in a new era that is cleaner, greener, and fundamentally more just. Thank you.
Thanks, Finn. And I'm really glad you brought up Earthrise because it really speaks to the power of pictures and visual communications and how that can actually be as effective, if not more effective, than verbal and written communications. And so with that, I want to turn actually back to Anthony and ask you the first question of the day, which is, it speaks to a report that was recently released from the Yale program on climate change communications, detailing how different names for natural gas can actually influence public perception of the resource as a viable energy source. And so that kind of suggests that there are certain words that are more effective, at least in particular contexts, in galvanizing support for climate action than other words. And so what are some examples of those types of words and how they might be applied in our everyday lives?
Sure. So thank you, Finn, for the presentation. And let me actually touch on the level that you went to, which is at the level of values and worldviews in the end. For those that don't know the work of Donella Meadows, there's a fabulous essay she wrote on 9 points to intervene in a system that I would encourage you all to look at. It's a wonderful framework to think about of where this deepest spade work really has to happen. And so I'm going to talk about just labels, even though that seems very surface. It turns out that they can be deeply, deeply rooted in culture. And so let's just take that example of the study that we released a few weeks ago on what do we call this thing that we call mostly natural gas. Okay, what we found is that when you relabel it as for what it actually is methane. Okay, it's methane. So what happens when you call it methane or methane gas? It turns out that Americans, at least, and I suspect many people around the world, immediately see that as a more negative thing. Okay, they have negative affect for it. Okay, this is about the emotional response. Are things good or are they bad? Natural gas feels like it's good in most people's views. Now, why is that? It's because of the addition of that little word, natural. That word does so much work in Western culture. Okay, the great cultural theorist Raymond Williams wrote a wonderful long piece about the word nature being the most complex word in the English language. And that little word natural carries with it so much connotative meaning, okay, that it creates a halo around that second word, gas, where people think, oh, because it's natural, therefore it's good. I've often had my students go into grocery stores and take pictures or write down every example of a product that has the word natural on the package. Natural means zero. It means absolutely nothing. There is no formal definition of natural in at least American food supply as compared with, say, a term like organic, which was fought over. Exactly what does that mean? So you can slap that word natural on all kinds of stuff and use it to sell people because natural seems good. We naturally we naturally say that nature and natural is good for you, or it's certainly better for you than anything artificial. That's something that the fossil fuel industry has been absolutely exploiting for a long, long time. They didn't create the term. It wasn't that insidious. There was a benign explanation for why they chose the word natural over 100 years ago, but they absolutely know it now. And they are fully exploiting the fact that every time we call it natural gas, because we just think that's the term that we should use, we're actually supporting them when they make the argument that this is the clean fuel. This is the bridge fuel. This is the fuel that will, help us get from the fossil fuel age to the clean energy future because it's cleaner than coal. It's cleaner than oil. It's natural. Whereas when you call it what it is, methane gas, people see that in a much more negative way. They see it as much more of a pollutant, which it is. It's a particularly powerful pollutant. Methane traps far more heat per molecule than does CO2. So it's just to say that these terms, and again, that word natural taps into some of the deepest assumptions of Western culture that have emerged in more recent years, because that same word nature used to be seen as a lesser, inferior thing. So as Finn was talking about, there's a long cultural tradition that comes out of Judeo-Christianity, by the way. Not science is just relatively recent on that, though it's had its own influence. This goes back to Genesis. Okay, Old Testament here is this notion of dominion of the earth, that God says we get to have dominion over the earth, and that has long been interpreted as we get to do with this resource anything that we want. It's here for us. Okay, and that has been used as justification to exploit the earth in all kinds of terrible ways. On the other hand, there's also another part of that same chapter, Genesis, and that is where God commands Adam and Eve to till and tend the garden. In other words, to take care of his creation, which, by the way, every time he did something like separate the heavens from the earth, kept saying, and it was good, and it was good. And it was good. So there's long been this battle within Western civilization over what is the appropriate interpretation of Genesis. Is it that we get to use nature any way we want, or are we here to be stewards of nature? And of course, then there are plenty others who come outside of the Judeo-Christian model who say you don't get the right to steward or dominion. Like, they are co-equal. That in many ways, human beings are lesser than all the other beings. Like, if we disappeared, not much happens. If plankton disappears, the world's in big trouble, right? So who's really the most important? But my point is, it's just that these struggles over the fundamentals of what does it mean to be human, what is nature, and what is the proper relationship between humans and the natural world, as well as humans to other humans, are some of the deepest cultural questions that we get at, that even show up in simple things like labels for natural gas or methane.
Yeah, a really brief follow-up question to that answer. So if methane gas, as opposed to natural gas, can be used as a tool for activists seeking to transition away from natural gas, I'm wondering how should they go about introducing that new term into the national lexicon, into people's vocabularies?
Yeah. So I think it totally depends on context. If you have 15 seconds on national television to talk about the issue, you probably need to use a term like natural gas, because at least everybody will know what substance you're talking about. But if you have a bit more time, I would say start introducing it and put the two terms together. So people start to increasingly associate the term methane gas for this same substance that they are literally piping into their homes and setting on fire in their kitchen. Okay? I mean, the fact is that we are polluting our interior spaces that are often more polluted because of the particulates that are spewing out of your stove and out of your oven, if you're still cooking with gas, that, by the way, are affecting women and children more than anyone else, and your guests, frankly, because people usually hang out in the kitchen at a party back in the days when we got together for parties. These devices are literally in our homes. This is some of the most important kinds of direct contact people have with fossil fuels, is things like using methane gas in the kitchen or as a way to heat their homes. And the fact is, you are burning a fossil fuel, open flame, in your home.
And Finn, I'd assume that another part of the reason why there is such a difference in the efficacy of different words is because the language of climate change has become so politicized and can really be oftentimes jargon heavy as well. And so are visual forms of communication like the short form video or the documentaries that you've produced able to cut through some of that noise and confusion and politicization? Just extending that question to a slightly broader scale, what are the key benefits of visual forms of communication over purely verbal ones?
I was just thinking, as Anthony was speaking there about, I remember very clearly when the Guardian newspaper here in the UK, I think it was about 2 years ago, made a very public declaration of changing the language they use. And rather than climate change, they would only use climate crisis or climate emergency. And for me, just in answer to the question you asked earlier about how we implement these changes in the way we phrase key words around the climate crisis, I think we need to be bringing in clear structures and mandates like that, whether it's for editorial organizations or media organizations, in the same way that the BBC, until fairly recently, would always have a climate denier that would debate the other side of the argument, and then finally got around to agreeing that they don't have to do that. So this sort of change in language is not only necessary, but needs to be actively encouraged in order to, I mean, the situation is changing so quickly as well with our understanding of the climate crisis and how bad it's getting, that we need to be adapting our language accordingly. So like for me, I found, I think one of the big issues with the climate crisis is we've had the research for a very long time, for perhaps 50 to 60 years even. And so we know that the scientific research doesn't necessarily cut through to the mainstream. And so what's interesting to me about visual media and storytelling is how you can take scientific facts, data. We make a big point on Earthrise of citing nearly every, we have citations for the research we're doing on nearly every post we put out. But we try and play really with how we communicate it. We try and find ways that will engage people in the otherwise busy, distracted world that they inhabit online. To me, visual media just represents a very exciting world of possibilities. As Anthony said, it's really about repeating the same messages over and over in many different formats and trying to find the key messages really in the same way I was talking about the foundations of the climate crisis. I think the risk is we often get too lost in sort of small details. It's such a large problem. I think it's really useful to try and address the key roots of it so that people can try and get their head around it. Yeah.
So can I make a follow-up comment?
Yeah.
So of course you need to be very conscious of the terms we use, the images we show. In fact, let me just quickly say that imagery has been a giant, massive problem of the media. Like we see when we ask Americans to just free associate to the term global warming, what images come to mind? And we've been doing this for over 10 years, and still one of the dominant images most people think of is melting ice. Okay. Glaciers melting around the world, sea ice on the Arctic Ocean, ice shelves breaking off of Antarctica. And that's good on a certain level because it reinforces that this is real and this is happening, because people do understand what happens if you take a glass of ice water out, or a glass of ice outside on a warm summer day. What happens? It melts, right? I don't have to explain any physics or chemistry to you. You know in your bones what's going to happen. So those images do reinforce the sense that it's real. But the problem is most of us, the great majority of us, none of us live on a glacier, on the Arctic Ocean, or in Antarctica. And as a result, it reinforces the sense that this is far away and distant. And by the way, the media, every time whenever a reporter does a great story about climate change, and it has nothing to do with melting ice, just a great story, the editor then takes it to the photo editor and says, okay, photo editor, get me an image for this article. And they almost always go with a picture of melting ice or a polar bear. Okay. Stop. It's just reinforcing something, because there's never any people in those pictures. There's never any sense that this is happening close to you. This is happening at high altitude or at the poles where most of us don't live. Okay. When in fact, this is a human story. And yes, there are plenty of fabulous stories about impacts on the natural world, but this is a human story, and there are human faces to this. And we need to be able to start using imagery that shows people, here's what this issue really, really means. Last thing, though, I really want to underscore, though, is the idea that there are different audiences. And different audiences will interpret things differently. Okay, I call these interpretive communities. Each of those 6 audiences I talked about is a different interpretive community. They will look at an image and it will mean something different to them because of their values and their culture and their social network. Okay, so let's just take that famous, wonderful photo that Finn started off with, the Earthrise photo, or the Earth from space, the full Earth, like that's become, you've seen that so many mazillion times, right? It's on t-shirts, love your mother. Okay? And everyone always says, oh, it's such a wonderful, like there's no lines on the map, there's no national boundaries, we're all in this one precious little blue dot, and look how thin the atmosphere is, it's so precious and so fragile, it should bring us all together. Well, other people look at that same picture and they go, look at how powerful human beings are. We can leave the planet, we can go to other planets. If we screw this one up, we'll go settle Mars, okay? That's actually a not uncommon interpretation of that exact same image. So all my point is that don't ever assume that your meaning of an image or a word or a concept is going to be shared by everybody, especially when you're thinking about who it is you're trying to reach.
Can I just jump off what Anthony was saying there?
Sure.
I mean, I couldn't agree more in terms of really Earthrise was founded with the goal of humanizing the climate crisis. And what's amazing to me is how quickly we've started to see that shift. I firmly grew up in the world of polar bears on ice caps and this being a future problem. And very quickly, we're seeing this affect not just humans on the other side of the world, but as we've seen in the US, even in the UK, humans that really feel like they could be in our community or are in fact in our community. So I think that's the key. I think unfortunately that the major tipping points into people getting more engaged on this issue will be when we see more human crises, more tragic weather events that lead to destruction or death of communities. But what we're trying to do at Earthrise is cultivate a sense of empathy. We're trying to help people understand how this affects other humans around the world and people that that they can relate to. And we've found that to be a really successful method to engage people with the issue.
Yeah, and another point that has been brought up multiple times already is the fact that repeated exposure to these types of stories, these types of images can actually positively impact people's beliefs and attitudes on the topic. But I'm wondering how, in the real world, how do you actually go about exposing the people who need to hear and see these types of stories and images to the stories and images? And it really goes for both of you. Maybe Anthony, if you want to start.
Well, sure. So, this is ultimately the job of strategic communication. And that is, you've got to, first of all, decide who your audience is, because how you answer that question is going to be very different depending on who they are. So let's just take some obvious examples. If you're trying to reach poor farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, you're going to need to use very different techniques and strategies and approaches than you would for an urban office dweller in New York City. So again, you really got to be clear about who your audience is and where do they get their information. Okay. And then how do you use those channels that they already pay attention to get that content in front of them? Okay. In a way that is meaningful, in a way that connects with what they already care about. Okay. If your goal is to say, we're going to get that poor sub-Saharan African user to be a TikTok user, that's like going to be really hard. Like if they don't even have electricity or they don't have internet service or so on, the number of barriers that are preventing them from being able to get content through TikTok is that you can just quickly see that is probably not the right tactic to use to engage that particular audience. So you would need to use something completely different. And really, I'm using that kind of extreme example because we often do this in lots of different ways where we just assume that, hey, I get my information from this source or through this medium. So therefore, I'm going to use that to communicate to the whole world. And it would be ridiculous to ask a sub-Saharan African farmer who doesn't even have cell service to be communicated through TikTok. But we do the same thing in terms of the way we talk about the issue. the issues that we talk about. Some people, like, they're all fixated on sea level rise, and it's a huge, massive, ginormous problem. But you can imagine that for somebody living in Nebraska, they don't care that much about sea level rise. They're thousands of miles from the ocean. And the number of systemic cause and effect, A causes B, causes C, causes D, causes E, causes F steps they have to take to realize that, yes, what happens to the coastline matters to them too. You're asking people to know and learn too much. And you don't have to, because the fact is that climate change is affecting corn agriculture right in Nebraska. Something that they already care deeply about because it permeates everything about society, the economy, life, etc. So that's really my suggestion is, again, who is that audience? How do you then connect the dots for them in the terms and about the issues about which they already care?
I'll jump in on this. It's a really, really good question, and it's probably the main question we ask ourselves. If you operate in a digital space like we do, you're all too aware of the echo chamber, and we often wonder if we're just simply preaching to the choir, preaching to the converted. But there's a couple of things we've been experimenting with that have worked and helped us reach people that perhaps we wouldn't have reached before. One is diversity of perspectives. Like on a big scale, you can see Netflix doing this and investing in international content, creating shows that are in the language of a certain country, attract an increased audience from that country. So we're trying to diversify the voices we're bringing on Earthrise and even testing out creating content in different languages such as Spanish. One of the best ways that we found to grow out of the echo chamber and to attract new audiences is to create debate. And unfortunately, we've seen this online, right? This is one of the reasons we're so polarized is that sort of the emotions of anger or on the other end of sort of extreme happiness are what drives clicks and engagement. And so we don't play on that too heavily, but if you can create a debate, then people tend to jump in, and we welcome debate because you get a diversity of perspectives. But the main way we've found success, the main way we engage people that aren't sort of following us traditionally is to collaborate. So to reach out to people who come from a different world to us and look at how we can create some sort of crossover in content, share it on our platform, share it on theirs, and then you hybridize audiences. But it's a real challenge. I think this is one of the changes we need to make online. There's a lot of sort of social justice activism or a lot of policing on the way you talk about a certain issue. This is something we're very aware of. And I think the risk with that is that we shouldn't all be communicating in the exact same way. So if we put out a post, an account or an activist that's, say, further left on the spectrum might be really upset with the way we worded something. But if we word it in the way that they would word it, we'd be aiming our content towards that audience. And so we're sometimes purposely not, it was purposely playing with language to try and introduce new audiences. And so there's small changes you can make there, but I think it's a real challenge. And that's something we need to address more broadly with digital communication, is how we break out of those echo chambers.
Yeah, definitely. I want to turn now a little bit to the question of messaging. And so something that's really established in the field as well is that the identity of the messenger matters. People are obviously more willing to listen to others who share their identity groups. But I'm wondering, in today's political context, whether there actually is a receptive audience for information that contradicts our core beliefs. So if I'm a climate denier and I'm listening to someone who I trust or have previously trusted talk about the urgency of climate action, am I actually gonna change my mind, or am I just no longer gonna see that person as someone who I can trust and who's a part of my identity group? Maybe Anthony, if you wanna take that one.
Sure. Well, unsurprisingly, I'm gonna say it depends, because one of the things I'll say is that probably unlike everybody on this call, most people don't actually root their identity in their views about climate change. Okay. So in fact, people's ability to change their beliefs and attitudes about climate change is much more fungible. Okay. And in fact, let me just give you an example of that, not about climate change, but what we just saw in the United States over the past few years. And that is that Republicans, who you used to know very consistently were completely for smaller government, free markets, open borders for more international trade, a strong international military presence. Like, these were bedrock ideologies. Like, we knew who Republicans were until Trump became president and then started saying, nope, we don't believe in any of that stuff anymore. Follow me, everyone. We're going over in this totally new direction. And the whole party followed him. Okay, to the surprise of many of the intellectuals within the party itself, who had always assumed that their intellectual, brilliance was what really was the glue that held that party together. No, turned out it was way more flexible than that. People actually don't really care that much about border adjustment taxes, and many other such things. So the point is that leadership matters a lot. Okay, so what I think you're going to find is that even for many people in the doubtful and dismissive categories, who do tend to be more conservative, at least here in the United States, if they hear from fellow conservatives that this is a serious problem, they will change their views. Relatively few of them have climate change as so central to their identity that they're not going to change that view no matter what their leaders say. Okay, so I think that actually gives us way more room to maneuver and more possibility of changing hearts and minds than many people sometimes expect. Because again, for those of us on this call, the fact that we are spending our evening listening and talking about this issue already is deep evidence that you are weird. You are an outlier. You care about this issue, far more than most people do.
I was just thinking about, I think that's a distinction I want to make between people talking. I sort of touched on this in my opening talk, but there's a distinction between people talking about the issue and then pointing people towards the right place to take action on it. Because I would suggest that really the main problem we have isn't awareness on the issue, as Anthony sort of pointed out in his graphs, but a sort of lack of knowledge of what to do. And I was thinking, as you were talking about Extinction Rebellion, which is the sort of international direct action protest group, which I was sort of quite involved with my brother in their early days. And one of their challenges was that they ultimately struggled to attract diverse groups of activists. People couldn't see themselves. It became sort of mainly white privileged individuals. And there are some reasons for that. Mainly privilege gives people the time to afford to be able to worry about these issues. But I think what we need to be doing is creating movements that are diverse and allow people to see themselves in them. And for me, that's important, because that's that second piece of what do I do now I know? Where can I go? Where's my group? I think resilience is something I'm really interested in, and community is a key part of that. That for me is the next step, is how do we create, whether it's digital or physical, supportive environments for people, not just to take action, but what we often don't talk about this issue is the environment, the emotional impact of going through the process of learning about the information, reflecting on how that's going to affect your future or the future of those around you. And so we need support for that. I can speak from firsthand experience of the toll it takes on mental health to engage with the reality of the climate crisis. So I'm really curious on how we develop a more diverse community environment to support people in that process of learning about the issue and then ultimately taking action on it.
So if I can jump in on that, because this is so important. So look, by and large, most, at least Americans, I don't claim to speak for the United Kingdom, but I bet it's pretty similar, still see that this is an issue that scientists care about, environmentalists care about, and some liberal politicians, at least in the US context, okay? And most people are none of those, okay? I'm speaking for the average American right now. I don't know any scientists. I mean, literally, I don't know any scientists. Only 1 in 200 Americans says they know a scientist personally. Okay, so they're not reading the IPCC reports. They're not talking to scientists over the backyard fence. Okay, they only interact with scientists through the media, essentially. Then there's environmentalists, and most Americans don't consider themselves environmentalists. They have all kinds of images about who an environmentalist is, and it's not me. They wear clothes that I don't wear. They wear perfume that I don't wear. They do things that I don't necessarily even approve of. Okay. And then liberal politicians, if you're not a liberal, then they're actually pushing you away. Okay. So we have to break that. And the good news is that for all the problems of climate change, I like to call it, it's the policy problem from hell. You almost couldn't design a worse fit for our underlying psychology or our institutions of decision making. But what climate change has going for it that is more so than just about any other issue is that it's all encompassing. Going back to what Finn was doing in his presentation. This is about the life support systems of the planet. Every single human being and every more than human critter on the planet has a direct and real stake in the outcome of this one. Okay, this affects all of us, and it affects everything we do and everything we care about as human beings. And that is a way of bringing the conversation to everyone, because everyone, in fact, can be part of this conversation. There are many, many roads to Damascus. Don't insist that everybody walk the same path you did, because then they're going to have to become just like you. And if we're waiting for everybody to become just like you, we're screwed. Okay. Your job as a communicator is to meet people where they are and help them walk their path, to walk beside them, sometimes to give them a little nudge, with your on the elbow, to help them see that it's safe to take that next step and to go, oh, do you care about coffee? Did you know that climate change is going to affect your morning coffee? Did you know that climate change is going to affect, asthma? Maybe you know somebody with asthma. Maybe you have asthma. Okay. Maybe you want to talk about it as in, this is the biggest economic opportunity the world has literally ever known. This transition that we are just now at the beginning of is so much bigger than this damn little thing. This is nothing. We're talking about rewiring the entire planet. Okay. Somebody's going to make a ton of money in that process. Okay. My point being is that there are many, many, many roads that people can take to get engaged with this issue. Your job as a communicator is to help them walk that path.
Yeah, it's a really good point about the diversity of perspectives and voices that are kind of in this fight together, and that we don't all have to walk down the same path. But I'm wondering, Finn, in your experience, how do you establish whether you are the right person to be telling this particular story, given that there are so many other people out there that could be saying the same thing? So why is this a story that you should be really producing and putting out there?
That's a great question. This is something that we're very aware of. So Earthrise is founded by myself, my brother, and his partner. And from the beginning, we created it as a space that was designed as a platform to create a space for other voices that are often marginalized in this conversation. So I think the short answer is that I shouldn't be the one talking about this issue, nor should it be my personal opinions that are shaping the way we communicate. As I mentioned earlier, I think that the reality is climate change is an issue that often people can't afford to think about because they have other priorities in their life that they need to worry about. I've been fortunate enough to have the opportunity to sit down and think about it and read a little bit about it while I was studying. And so I'm trying to use that as best I can to get a conversation going. But that just goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is that what we really need is really to maximize the diversity of perspectives on this conversation. I think the narrative thus far has been led from quite a parochial point of view. I don't think we've heard enough from people that are on the front lines of this crisis. So that's really one of the key ideas behind Earthrise, is to create a diversity of perspectives. And it's a fine balance between creating content that engages our audience and grows that community, and then putting out voices that perhaps people don't recognize, but we feel are important to share.
So I'd like to just springboard on that. So again, if you want to see thousands of examples of this, and I do mean thousands, come to our website, Climate Connections, and check out these radio stories, because that's exactly what we have done. Again, what we've learned from the research is just to this point of how important it is to diversify the voices that literally people get to hear, okay? And so what you'll see is that there are diverse voices, people from every walk of life, young, old, rich, poor, farmers to doctors to lawyers to business people, small to large, faith leaders, and people on the front lines who are doing two key things. One, telling in first-person narratives, their own stories of how climate change is right here, right now, and harming the things we care about now. And secondly, the stories and the voices of people who are rolling up their sleeves and getting involved and making a difference. Okay. And there are so many exciting and inspirational ways that people are taking action and solving this problem right now. And this is just another huge failing of the mass media, is that they almost never tell those stories. Okay. These are solution stories. And it's not just enough to say, hey, how exciting that there was X gigawatts of solar power put on the grid last year. That's a statistic, as opposed to being able to hear from a former oil worker who has converted his life to now installing solar, and how it's changed his life and changed his relationship to work. And now he's got his kids doing it. Which of those two stories do you want to listen to? Okay. And so the power of storytelling is absolutely essential. And storytelling as a way to role model. Okay. Here's what people who look like you, audience, dress like you, sound like you, share your values, why people who are just like you also care about this issue. That it's not just scientists and environmentalists and liberal politicians. This is, in fact, all of us. And there are wonderful examples, role models of people from every which walk of life that are already rolling up their sleeves and taking action. I will say personally, I've become so inspired by the privilege of being able to do these kinds of stories for over 7 years, because I had no idea how much amazing, incredible work is being done out there that most of the time goes unrecognized by a larger national audience. So anyway, this is really critical. Find those role models, diverse voices, and amplify them.
Yeah, and I think that's a great note to kind of end on and really turn to the audience questions, just being conscious of time as well. So the first question that we have is about COP26, and it's what are your hopes for COP26, especially for effective communication? And I would just add, what would you say, what advice would you give for communicating to politicians in particular who might be approaching COP26 in the coming weeks, and how best or how should we go about communicating the urgency of the crisis to someone from that background?
Well, it's a hard question. I mean, look, what do I hope comes out of the COP? I hope that the world comes together, collectively says, yep, this is so much worse than we thought it was back in Paris, that we're going to redouble our efforts. We're going to recommit. We're going to finance the Green Fund for developing countries, the most vulnerable countries, at the full amount. We're going to, start working together to put a global price on carbon. I mean, look, I can come up with all kinds of stuff that I'd love to happen. Just it's not going to. Okay, and so I think we need to recognize that this COP is part of a longer process. I have been going to COPs now for far too long, well over 20 years. And so these are not final destinations. These are stepping stones along the way. So while, of course, we want everything I just said and much more out of this COP, don't put all the eggs in that particular basket, because the fact is that we're going to keep coming back to this issue again and again and again and again and again, because this is now truly a generational struggle. Even if they did everything I just said, we would still be coming back to the COPs again and again and again, because there's so much more that will need to be done. So anyway, one is to have the proper expectations calibrated for ourselves, so we don't have to go into an extended period of 6 months of grieving and mourning and taking ourselves off the sideline, or taking ourselves out of the game, because we need everybody very active for the next 6 months after the COP too. But in the end, one of the most important things that we can all do is what we call build public and political will for action. We are not lacking a supply of solutions. Okay, let me say that again. We are not lacking a supply of solutions. We have all the tools we need right now to fix this. Okay. We have the technology, we have the money, we know what the policies are. But what we lack is the demand for those solutions. Okay. That's the critical missing piece. And political leaders know this. They aren't willing to be bold because they don't feel like, one, we've got their back, and secondly, that we're putting enough pressure on them as individuals, but also on their opponents to take further action. And so I think back to what Finn was saying before about this is where the emerging global citizens movement is absolutely critical, and is one of the best exciting things happening in the world today, is that these aren't just movements that are emerging locally or even within individual countries. This is now a global movement, okay, that is harnessed together by things like this little device that is so much more powerful, and that is going to make its voice heard at this COP and many, many other opportunities coming forward to put the pressure on political leaders, on business leaders to change the system. Okay. I think that's absolutely critical. And this is one of the things that communication absolutely has to be at the center of, is how do you engage those people, those alarmed I was talking about, those millions of people who are already deeply, deeply alarmed about this issue, but they don't know what to do. And when we ask them, are you willing to join a campaign to convince elected officials to act? We see that millions of them are, like over 25 million in the United States alone. But when we ask, why haven't you done it? The number one answer they say is that nobody's ever asked.
Do you have anything to add to that?
I couldn't agree with Anthony more there. I mean, my biggest fear for COP is that it sort of slides by relatively unnoticed by the general public, as most of the previous COPs have done. The challenge, and I don't think that will be the case, I think we have more attention on this COP than ever before, but the challenge with previous COPs have been that they're absurdly boring processes to follow. The Conference of the Parties, the IPCC, these all seem very abstract to the most normal people. So what I'm curious is like, how can we create more engagement around this event? How can we make those political leaders that are meeting to determine their national contributions famous? And I actually have faith that that we're already seeing much more attention on this event than we've seen in previous ones. Formally, the sort of main goal of the COP is sort of agreement on net zero commitments. That wasn't something that was mentioned in Paris, but even that, again, as Anthony sort of touched on, that doesn't go far enough. We're way past our carbon budget. We need to be drawing down. So even a magic global agreement on hitting net zero by X date still doesn't go far enough, particularly in light of social justice. And so, again, as Anthony said, really that's where the pressure should be put on here, is to make sure that those decisions that are being made are not just considering the nation for which the leader is making the commitment, but their responsibility. For example, if it's a developing country like the UK, the US, that they're balancing out their responsibility for their historic emissions. But there we will see at this COP much more than previous ones, demonstrations. I know there are a very large delegation of Indigenous leaders going down. We're premiering the series I mentioned, Seat at the Table, which is an 11-part video series that literally goes around the world and puts people on the front lines of the climate crisis into a chair, the chair that they don't have at the negotiation table, and they tell their story. And we're projecting that onto the Armadillo building where the discussions are happening. And so, our goal is really to try and bring those stories that aren't heard and that aren't being considered during the decision process and put them as firmly as we can in front of political leaders. And I think the last thing to say is these decisions are really tough to make. They're like, political leaders are humans like all of us. It's not easy to sort of systemically change the way your country or economy runs. And so we really need to be keeping as much pressure on as possible. I mean, really, that's where we're going to see politicians responding, when they feel the weight of the citizens that they represent, watching them and holding them to account for the promises that they've made in the past.
Yeah, in a related question, but a little bit more towards the climate finance aspect of things. Someone has asked, 70 to 80% of climate finance flows to mitigation, so mitigation of mitigation techniques. Should funds be reallocated to adaptation and developing effective communication platforms, or is mitigation more critical? So how do we think about those trade-offs in funding, and should more go towards the climate communication aspect of things?
Yeah, well, I'll take a quick stab at that. So first of all, it's too late to have the discussion of can we only talk about mitigation anymore. The impacts are here, they're now, they're harming millions of people around the world right here, right now. They've been harming millions of people around the world for decades, okay? But now it's really starting to cause major economic as well as life and limb kind of damage around the world, and it's just unavoidable. And so the simple moral response is, of course, we have to start dealing with preparation and resilience building for what's already coming. Even if we stopped all emissions today, we're still going to have terrible consequences because of how much energy is already baked into the system. So this is not an avoidable conversation, and we can't think of these as opposites. And moreover, from a comm standpoint, I think this was a huge strategic error on the part of the climate community to basically say adaptation is a taboo word. And I understand their logic. They thought that if we started talking about adaptation, then that would give people the green light to say, oh, well, then we don't need to mitigate because we'll just adapt our way out of this problem, right? We'll just raise, the roads a little bit and, elevate some buildings and we'll be fine from sea level rise. Like, we'll just adapt. I understand that. I think it was freaking stupid because mitigation is a global conversation in the end, right? Because every molecule of CO2 that gets released goes up in the atmosphere, and within a couple of weeks, it's evenly distributed around the world. This is why we call it global climate change. And the way that we knew about it was at the global scale. And we have talked about it from the global scale, and now we've tried to translate to downscale all of that knowledge and information down to the local level. And yet most people are intensely local. Most people are born, live, and die within just a few miles of the same location, okay? The vast majority of people don't know that much about international affairs or care that much, frankly. In the United States, it's always stunning how many Americans can't identify the Pacific Ocean on a map, okay? And yet, as scientists, we literally are like aliens landing our spaceship into these little communities and saying, and coming out speaking language of parts per million of CO2 and carbon cycles and, and methane and nitrous oxide. And let me tell you about chlorofluorocarbons. All this gobbledygook foreign language and concepts that people have no background, no training, no interest in, and they don't see why I should care about some global problem that looks like it's having an impact on maybe some polar bears, 5,000 miles away. Whereas if you had started the conversation about adaptation, which really is a question about vulnerability, what we have found from a number of partners in the field is that when you start the conversation with a community to say, how are we vulnerable to these impacts right now? What would it take for us to organize ourselves and to change and build our own resilience? What kinds of resources are we have to spend to protect ourselves against what we're already experiencing from heat waves and droughts and floods and so on? And you've got people's attention because they're already struggling with these things. And then you go, and if temperatures rise another 0.5 degree, what are we going to do then? And if they rise another degree, what's that going to cost us? And if it rises 2 degrees, what's that going to cost us? And what we find is that when people go through that process, they suddenly get really interested in mitigation because they realize there's no way we can adapt our way out of this. But the critical difference conceptually in consciousness is that you started by rooting the problem in where they live and what they already care about and how they're already vulnerable, and you work your way up to the global scale, as opposed to the way that we've done this is started at the global level and tried to bring it down to the local level, okay? That makes a huge difference in terms of your ability to engage people.
I'm just going to jump in. So again, completely in line with Anthony's thoughts there. I just wanted to make some sort of distinction. So of course, yes, we should be talking about adaptation. That's that is the rational conversation to be having. I think we need to define what adaptation means. So as Anthony mentioned, it's easy to think about this as something perhaps far off, but really there are communities that are experiencing this today that have been for decades, and adaptation for them means moving migration. I mean, by 2050, we're looking at 1 billion migrants. And so we really need to be thinking about how we define adaptation. It's not small scale changes, it's really quite significant. And then within that as well, is adaptation a sort of top-down infrastructural approach that I would argue still sits somewhat in the degenerative category? Is it sort of large concrete seawalls, etc.? Or is it looking at how communities or even nature has adapted in the past? So for example, indigenous communities, again, the great examples of they are the original sort of regenerative stewards, and they have learned over time, over millennia, to adapt with nature in symbiosis with nature. And we can look at natural systems as a great example for ways to adapt to changes. So I think we need to focus on adaptation, but it shouldn't be a sort of a top-down infrastructure heavy approach that's sort of like blanketed across the world, but really we should be empowering local communities and local knowledge and working as closely as possible with natural systems in the way we adapt.
So we have time for one last question, and it's about multi-directional climate communication. Can you say a little bit more about learning from traditional ecological knowledge in the communities experiencing the worst effects of climate change?
I'll jump in on that, yeah. So, I mean, this ties in with something that's sort of theme that's been running through my opening talk and a couple of the points I've made, but I think this is really critical. I think, like, if you go to the big picture that I talked about of existing within a social structure, a society, a civilization, if you want, that is fundamentally degenerative, then that provokes perhaps some thought into other ways of living, other ways of structuring our lives, other stories by which to organize ourselves. And this isn't, often when I have this conversation with people, it feels like we're sort of imagining some utopia that doesn't yet exist. But the truth is that there are loads of amazing and inspiring examples of communities around the world that perhaps we're not aware of because they don't have space in the mainstream media. That, as I said, this is why indigenous communities are referenced so heavily. These are communities that have a lineage that go back for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so there's knowledge there that's being gained that we're still, in the sort of Western or in the mainstream world coming to appreciate, coming to terms with. That much of it's been lost already, and so it's really vital that we work to protect it, but that we listen, and that we perhaps have some humility or a little bit more humble. It seems to me that the last couple of years have been sort of dominated by a sort of a line of thought that that sort of roots in science, as I mentioned, scientific empiricism and industrial culture, and at the time, we felt we were doing the right thing, that we were on this sort of great technological development, but in reality, as we sort of take a step back now, perhaps we weren't seeing clearly. So I think just now is a really critical time to be a little bit more humble and look towards cultures that have been historically oppressed and silenced, and think about how we might do things differently.
And I'll just add to that. I mean, there's a lot of different angles to this, but I'll just draw from my own personal experience working with the Nupik Eskimo communities in the Arctic Circle, who've taught me so much about this issue, and more importantly, how to engage as a community in it. And I was fortunate to be able to bring together elders, hunters, leaders from across the pretty wide, expansive geography together to try to deal with how can we collectively start to work together to actually prepare for what's already happening here, because the Arctic is warmed 2 to 4 times faster than the rest of the world. You want to know what climate change is going to look like? Go to the Arctic. It's already plus 2 degrees C in the Arctic. And so they're already struggling with a lot of these issues, including forced relocation and migration and so on. But one of the things that I learned so importantly about that is that, there's the old African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And that was one of the things they taught me so beautifully, was that they actually needed to take the time to storytell, to listen to one another, to hear from each person, to say, here's what is changing in my local ecology. Here's how the moose are arriving in places that we've never seen them before, how we're seeing flies for the first time in cultural history, how the whales don't come in the way that they used to anymore, how the permafrost is melting underneath our airstrip. All of these concrete stories, one after another, that are all signs of how the land and the air and the water are changing because of climate change. And it was only once the room as a whole of 30 different people had shared those stories that there literally was born in the room itself a shared collective consciousness of the issue. And that was the moment that they then turned to us as the outsiders, as the experts, and said, okay, now we're ready to talk. Okay. Sometimes these conversations are the first and most important thing we can do before we immediately leap to here's what you can do. Okay, is that you've got to get people engaged. And so really the core thing I'm saying here is that two-way conversation, as important as one-way conversation is, it's not an either or, it's a both and. But conversation is one of the most important superpowers that all of us have, is the ability to talk to your friends, to your family members, to your coworkers, to your colleagues, to your faith leaders, directly to your leaders in conversation and saying, here's why this is so important to me and to all of us collectively, and why we need you to act.
And on that note, I just want to say a huge thanks to Finn and Anthony for really providing a really interesting insight into climate communications and the challenges and opportunities that we face in navigating this field. And so to our audience, I hope that you've enjoyed tonight's event. I know I personally have. In 2 weeks, we will be hosting another event with Disha Ravi and Jessica Kitso to talk about climate activism. It'll be streamed on YouTube in the exact same manner as this event. You can go to our Facebook page for more details of that event. But with that, I'll bring this to a close. And I hope you all have a great rest of the evening and that you have enjoyed this event as much as I have. Thanks again.